All right, Shalom. First and foremost, want to give all praises to Yahweh Bashem, Yahweh Shai Bashem Kakadash. All right, Shalom. To you, Akim and Akwaf out there. All right, Shalom to the hopeful elect, the body of believers that was prophesied to return in these latter days, men, women, and children. All right, Shalom. I just wanted to get into this Evergrande situation and bring out some information. Hopefully it brings some understanding, to whoever's listening. And I just thought it was something, relatively important to keep your eye on because, we're living in very, serious times, all right? And it's really to the point where any one event could really set off a series of chain reactions, so to speak, all right, which could drastically change, people's lives at any moment, really. Like we're that close, financially speaking, with the debt, with the debt that America's in, with the debt that everyday people are in. The world is really, swimming in debt. You have a lot of countries. You have a lot of countries, more countries than not in the world, are in, trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. All right, and the question is to who? But the answer to that question is, these central banks, all right, and these multinational banks, these international banks, all right, which are headed by, the international banking families that run the world, all right, the Amalekites, all right, who are, the chief house of Edom, all right, Esau. Job 9:24 goes into that, the earth was given into the hands of the wicked, and they're the ones that are running this world system, all right. So, when you consider current events, it's very important to just, it can be hard sometimes because, the technicalities and the technical terms, that comes with, finance. But when I get a chance to find some information that's relatively easy to digest, I think it's important to bring it out. Lord willing, it's edifying. So I just wanted to bring out a few scriptures first. All right, I'm just gonna go in the spirit. All right, it says, this is Proverbs 22:7. It says, the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. All right, the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Okay, and just to lay it back on the last point that I made, a majority of these nations on the earth, even the more powerful nations, China, all right, America, these nations are in debt. Okay, these nations are ultimately servants to these central banks. All right, governments are really not even, fulfilling their own will. All right, ultimately they are all in servitude, okay, to these international banking families that own everything. All right, they own a large majority of the land on the earth. They own a large majority of the resources, and they have immense power. All right, militarily, financially, technologically, they have a firm grip over the planet Earth. All right, but ultimately, they were set up by the Lord. All right, and when you really analyze, this fiat monetary system that the world is under, the simplest way to put it is it's really a big, it's really a big illusion. All right, paper money, Federal Reserve notes, the dollar, they have no value. They're completely worthless. They're just pieces of paper. All right, they have no intrinsic value. All right, and in most cases, they're just reflections of debt. You know, and what's interesting about it is you have most people convinced now, and now in today's world, that digits and paper dollars mean that you have wealth. You know, that you have resources and money. But really, all of that stuff is dependent on there being goods and services for you to receive. You know, and we're coming into times, like the scriptures say, where storehouses will be empty. When you look at this world system, which is based on globalization, if you don't know what that is, I would suggest looking it up. But essentially, all the world economies are they're dependent on each other rather than being self-sufficient. All right, rather than being independent. All right, all these other nations are dependent on, or all the nations of the world are basically dependent on one another to survive. You'll have um, a product. You'll have the base of a product made in one country, then shipped to another country where they add one part to it, and then they'll ship it to another country, and they finish the product and then ship it back to the original country. It's a big old it's a big mess, man. It's horribly designed. It's inefficient, and it wastes natural resources. It's terrible. But what's beautiful about it is it brings light and it helps you understand the fact that how about Shem Shai, this system, this world system that was set up through Esau Edom, it was meant to explode or implode on itself. All right, it wasn't meant to be sustained. It was meant to be destroyed. It is a big it's a big scam. All right, so when you consider digits in your bank account, that are literally nothing. They're just digits on a screen. When you consider, fiat currency, paper money, it's all an illusion. All right. Real wealth is land. All right. And real wealth is subjects. All right. Servants, human resources. All right. Land, human resources, and then you get into like, precious metals, gold, silver, animals, etc., etc. All right, because those things have intrinsic value to them. All right, that's where the real, wealth lies, and all that stuff is in the hands of very few. So even Jake, you have who feels like he's well off, because he makes $100,000 a year. I mean, that's literally crumbs. All right, it's crumbs, and like I said, what is $100,000 in your bank account going to do when there are no groceries at the grocery store? All right. When CVS is empty. All right. When all these stores, these retail stores, are out of business. All right. And what good is that stuff going to do when ultimately you have to take the MOTB. All right. The Revelations 13:16. All right. So that's why it's so important to let this go. All right. To let, do what you got to do, to make it. But at the end of the day, we're, like the scriptures say, we're storing up our treasures in heaven. We don't really have any stock into this world. All right. We're putting our stock into the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the scriptures. All right. And doing the work. All right. Spreading the word of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. All right. And according to your measure, of course, because we're ultimately that's what we're going to receive. That's the only thing that's going to go up in value as time goes on. Everything else is depreciating in value. All right, so let me grab another scripture. This is Proverbs 23:23. It says, buy the truth and sell it not, also wisdom and instruction and understanding. And the scriptures say, wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times. All right, in the fear of the Lord, a treasure, roughly paraphrasing. All right, these are the things that are truly valuable because these are the things that are going to deliver you from death, Lord will. All right, these are the things that are going to protect you. All right, these are the things that are going to lead to immortality. And there's nothing more valuable than immortality, than life. All right, you can't not put a price on that, you know? So let me grab one more scripture. This is Matthew 6:20. It says, "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal." All right? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. All right? And that's the difference. That's the major, major difference. All right? The powers to be, okay, the Federal Reserve and these international banking families, they have set up a system that was meant to implode. All right? And when it does implode, don't be surprised when, you know, a large majority of assets, of things that people own, all right, they're going to be seized, all right, they're going to be taken, all right, ultimately because everybody is in debt, okay, America's in debt, which means by default, everything inside of America, all right, is not really yours, okay, because it was bought with debt, all right, if that makes sense, okay, so everything you have really isn't yours anyway, you know, and it's gonna get real out here, all right, because people are going to lose everything, all right, but if you claim to come under the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the scriptures, this should be exciting you because these are all the things that our Lord warned us about, all right, before His return, all right, and ultimately we don't give a damn about this shit anyway, man. If you're in the right spirit, you should be ready for this place to be destroyed, all right, ready for this place to be broken down, all right. So I'm gonna go ahead and read a brief piece from this article going into Evergrande. It's on the BL.com. The name of the article is Ripple Effect: Collapse of Real Estate Giant Evergrande would impact economy beyond China. It says financial institutions believe that Chinese real estate colossus Evergrande could collapse at any time with a debt of 300 billion, wreaking havoc not only on the Chinese economy, but the impact would be on a global scale. The collapse of the real estate giant would have a domino effect far beyond China, as noted by the Financial Times. Evergrande counts big international companies among its investors, including Allianz, Ashmore, and BlackRock. All right, look up BlackRock. BlackRock is the biggest asset manager in the world. All right, they manage $9 trillion worth of assets. All right, and have 70 offices in 30 countries. All right, and clients in over 100 countries. All right, these are the type of people that are invested into this company, Evergrande. All right, it says a default is likely to have spillover effects on global markets where many investors have historically anticipated Chinese government support at times of distress. All right, so like I said, this is just something to keep our eye on. You know, they could be bought out, by the Chinese government. However, we have to remember, with this whole pandemic situation, all right, where did it start? All right, where did it start? All right, and you have to keep in mind that these international banking families, they have been invested in China. All right, when you watch the mainstream news, it may appear, that China is some big bad, anti-America, entity. But behind the scenes, the ruling class elite have perfected the NWO, um, framework. They have perfected that system in China. All right. And Australia is getting a piece of that, getting a taste of that right now as we speak. But that system was perfected in China. They invested a lot of money, and these corporations also invested a lot of money in China. They moved their operations to China. All right. So that's why it's also important, to filter the mainstream media through the scriptures and to understand that the entire world is controlled by, you know, Esau Edom, all right, the international banking families. They are invested in both sides, all right. Whenever something may appear that there are two sides, just know that they're behind both sides, profiting off of the conflict, all right. And this is a trend that we've seen throughout the course of history, going all the way back, to the wars between Britain and Napoleon, all right, and others, all right. But I don't want to get off on a tangent, all right. I'm just gonna go ahead and play this clip that I found of I forgot what this guy's name was. See if I can find his name real quick. But yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and play the clip of the guy explaining the Evergrande situation. Shalom, Lord willing, let's edify.
Evergrande, or Grand. I'm going to pronounce it Evergrande because I think that's how Americans, and that's exactly what's happening with Evergrande. It really is like the La Palma volcano slash landslide tsunami, but in the financial market. It's really much the same thing. That's why I find it fascinating, just energetically speaking, that these two things are happening about the same time. And imagine if they both happen. Imagine if there's a contagion debt collapse from Evergrande and the La Palma Island, lets loose, and then there's a giant tsunami wave that strikes the East Coast. Folks, I'm telling you, America will not survive that. Probably China won't survive it. I tend to pronounce it. Evergrande, this is, of course, the name of the now known as giant Ponzi scheme property developer in China. And this is the company that's largely responsible for building the ghost cities full of millions of apartments in tens of thousands of buildings that have been constructed over the last, couple of decades that nobody's living in. And I've warned about this in previous podcasts. You may recall I've said that there's going to be a day where the China Ponzi scheme, the China speculation bubble collapses. Well, it appears that day has arrived. Oh yeah, the collapse has begun with Evergrande. Now, to understand what happened here, go back to Bernie Madoff and the Ponzi scheme in the United States that Madoff ran. And remember, Madoff was he was the head of which trading exchange? I think Madoff was the head of NASDAQ, right? And he convinced a lot of people that if they gave him money, that he would make amazing returns for them. I don't know what it was, 20% a year or something. And people would give him money, and he would generate fake trading transactions on paper. He actually had printers running at night after the market closed, and he would just sort of back trace all the trades in order to generate apparent gains. And then he would update everybody's accounts, electronically. People would log in and say, oh my gosh, we're making 20%. And so everybody kept giving him more and more money. And as long as he was getting more money in a classic Ponzi structure, of course, he was able to keep this thing going. The Ponzi schemes don't collapse until people want their money back. When people want their money back, then, there's not enough equity, no cash in the system, because it's all been faked from the get-go. But as long as Ponzi schemes are expanding and finding new victims, they can continue to appear to be generating profits. And, of course, the entire U.S. stock market is now a giant Ponzi scheme, but that's a different subject. The Evergrande story in China is that the company employs 200,000 people, or did, and they use all kinds of construction companies, and they had, it seems like half the country of China was putting their money in Evergrande because it was known as like one of the top Fortune 500 global companies, and it was just by itself, it was 2% of the GDP of China. 2% of the entire nation's GDP. And people wanted big returns on their money. And so they would invest in Evergrande using what are called WMPs, or wealth management products, which are basically just kind of like IOUs from a company. And people would hand over their life savings. Oh, here's $100,000 or renminbi. And they would get back like 10% a year, or sometimes more, sometimes less, sometimes 15%. And the company, Evergrande company, was then sort of doing the Bernie Madoff thing, and it was appearing to make a lot of money for people. So more money kept flooding in. So Evergrande had to keep building more buildings to pretend like this wasn't a Ponzi scheme, that this was actually a real thing. Like, oh, we're building things. See, you can look at the buildings. You can look at the apartments. They're real. And they were real. They were building things, except they didn't really pay the construction companies on time. And they didn't even pay them in full. They tried to negotiate with a lot of the construction companies to say, hey, how about we'll pay you 90% of what we owe you. The other 10% take it as an investment in Evergrande, like an IOU. And we'll pay you, 10%, 15%. So Evergrande was getting discounts on construction by handing out IOUs, essentially, more debt. And then people were investing their life savings and saying, we want to invest in your buildings. And because we want to have retirement one day and get paid all these high rates of return and so on. So we want to own your apartments. So Evergrande just kept building and building and building. The Ponzi scheme expanded until it suckered in more and more of the country using these very high-risk WMPs and other kinds of debt instruments. And of course, there's a moment where the whole thing, the music stops. There's a moment where people say, okay, I've waited and I'd like my money back. And Evergrande, as of last week, could not meet its debt obligations. And also, I think there was another one due 2 days ago that they couldn't meet, like millions of dollars in payments. They just said, well, we just don't have the money right now. They were trying to negotiate with people, say, hey, how about you take some apartment buildings in exchange, trying to offload their apartments now that they're out of cash. So the argument right now is, or the debate is, will the government of China bail them out because Evergrande might be too big to fail, just like long-term capital management in America in 1997, or, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman Brothers, 2008 subprime mortgage collapse situation. Is China going to bail them out, or is China going to let it fail? If China lets it fail, there's going to be hundreds of thousands, probably millions actually, of Chinese people, but at least hundreds of thousands who are angry enough. They've already gone into the Evergrande offices. They were holding the executives hostage at one point. That's fascinating. Pitchforks at the gate. They're climbing over the walls of the corporate castle. Pour the boiling oil. But no, can you blame these people? They're angry because they turned over their life savings. They were promised all these payouts, and then it turns out it was all a sham. The money's not there. It was all fiction. It was just illusion. So if China lets it fail, people get burned bad, not just the citizens, but here's what else happens. The contagion factor kicks in. Then the other creditors who had loaned Evergrande money, such as, big Asian banks. Big Asian banks get totally stiffed and have to write off all the money that they were due. The millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions in debt payments that are due and now overdue. And then those Asian banks, suddenly they have to take a big loss, which means they can't fund their debt instruments where they can't make their debt payments to other banks that they owe money to or other institutional investors that they owe money to, and so on. And because everybody is leveraged to the hilt, everybody's been running on debt. I mean, even the Chinese people, many of them, they would borrow money from banks at 5%, invested into Evergrande in order to earn 9%, let's say. So they were just taking out loans to put money into Evergrande. That whole thing collapses. Well, then they have to declare bankruptcy. They can't pay back their original loans to the banks that they borrowed from. So Chinese banks, and actually banks all over Asia, there were other banks involved in this in terms of being creditors. There's going to be a ripple effect that is now going to spread like a contagion, like a financial tsunami throughout Asia. Which brings me back to LTCM 1997. And LTCM, I don't know if you recall this, but in 1997, long-term capital management was one of these derivative investment groups for the rich in America. And LTCM had been making crazy bets on, speculative, highly leveraged bets on currencies of Southeast Asian countries, specifically, if I recall, Thailand. And they had bet on Thailand currency. Now, LTCM was one of these groups that Gerald Celente refers to as the white shoe boys. You know, the Wall Street banksters, the gangsters, the people who are connected to Washington, where they're always covered by someone else. They never have to take the losses, but they always get the gains. And since LTCM had bet on the Thai, the baht, I think it was, the currency, it moved against them sharply because of other economic things happening in Southeast Asia. Suddenly, the entire valuation of LTCM turned upside down, and they were in the red. They went from, billions in the green, you could say, to suddenly billions in the red overnight. They were broke and they couldn't meet their debt obligations. And the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury stepped in at that time under Clinton because it was said that if you don't save LTCM, listen to this, the entire Western financial system will collapse. And that's where we got the term too big to fail. It's so big, they owed so many people, they had so much debt that you can't let it fail. This was the thinking, because if you let it fail, it brings down the entire system. Now, fast forward to today, 24 years later or so. Is today's system, 24 years later, is it a bigger house of cards or a smaller house of cards? Oh, well, it's much bigger. We are tens of trillions of dollars deeper into this swampity swamp black hole of risk. Tens of trillions deeper, with more derivatives, with more risk, with more interbank contagion vulnerabilities, more fiat currencies. The situation we're in today globally makes 1997 look like a walk in the park. 1997 was nothing. In fact, the bailout of LTCM was nothing compared to the bailout of just COVID stimulus. I mean, the LTCM bailout wasn't even $1 trillion. Today, $1 trillion is like, oh, $1 trillion? It's Monday. Let's print another $1 trillion. The risk right now, in my analysis or opinion, is that this contagion out of Evergrande in China could spread out of control very quickly if the Chinese government mishandles it. And they are very likely to do so, I think, because, well, they're communists. They don't understand what's going on. Really, they don't understand the dynamics, the cause and effect, or the level of derivatives risk, and overlaying risk upon risk upon risk. Derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. It's like the subprime mortgage collapse situation in 2008. You got to watch the movie again, The Big Short. one of the best movies ever as far as I'm concerned. Watch The Big Short. They were selling derivatives of derivatives based on junk home loan debt that was rated A++ or whatever. And, it all, of course it was going to collapse. It was engineered on nothing. It was all a scam from the start. And this describes our global economy and our global currencies, our global governments. It's all a giant financial scam. And the scam, all it needs is one earthquake, you could say. One little financial earthquake, which could be Evergrande, not so little, to spread like wildfire throughout the system. There's a very real risk that this can happen. And it can happen at lightning speed. As James Rickards calls it, Ice 9, a freezing of the banking financial system. All the transactions freezing up because nobody has any fluidity or liquidity to be able to engage in the movement of money any longer. Now, we don't know for sure how far this is going to spread, how this will affect U.S. banks or European banks, but there's a very real risk that the Evergrande collapse could be the tipping point of a global financial debt bomb contagion that ends up taking out many banks and even governments around the world, or I should say central banks around the world. There's a risk.